In the humid shadows of New Orleans, where jazz music danced through narrow streets and ancient secrets whispered from wrought iron balconies, a predator emerged from the darkness wielding an axe. Between 1918 and 1919, someone stalked the night, leaving behind a trail of blood and terror that would forever change the Crescent City. What made this killer different was not just the brutal methodology, but the impossible patterns that emerged from each attack. But before we start, subscribe to follow our investigations into darkness. The official records speak of 12 documented assaults, 6 deaths, and 1 letter that defied all logic. Yet the true horror lay not in what the authorities recorded, but in what they deliberately chose to omit from their final reports. It was May 23, 1918, just after midnight, when the first attack shattered the quiet of Marigny neighborhood in New Orleans, Louisiana. The humid air hung thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms and something darker that seemed to seep from the very foundations of the old city. Joseph Maggio, an Italian grocer, and his wife Catherine lay sleeping in their modest home on Upper Line Street, unaware that death approached with methodical precision. The killer had entered through the back door, using a chisel to remove the wooden panel with surgical care. No glass shattered, no wood splintered violently. The entry appeared almost ritualistic in its deliberate execution. Inside the modest dwelling, Joseph's own axe became the instrument of destruction. The weapon, taken from the couple's own woodshed, delivered devastating blows that ended their lives within moments. When police arrived at dawn, they discovered something that would become the signature of every subsequent attack. The axe lay abandoned near the bodies, positioned at an exact angle that investigators would later realize formed a perfect 45-degree alignment with the front door. More disturbing still, a straight razor had been used to slash both victims' throats after the axe work was complete. The combination of blunt force trauma and precise blade work suggested a killer with both tremendous strength and surgical control. Detective John D'Antonio, a 20-year veteran of the New Orleans Police Department, noted in his initial report that the scene contained no signs of struggle. The victims appeared to have been attacked while still asleep, yet both bodies were found in positions that suggested they had attempted to rise from their bed. The blood spatter patterns indicated the attacks occurred in rapid succession, but the positioning of the bodies defied the laws of physics as D'Antonio understood them. 3 weeks later, the pattern repeated with horrifying consistency. Louis Bissumer, a grocer of German descent, and his companion Harriet Lowe were attacked in their home on D'Aulgenois Street. The same methodical entry, the same use of the victim's own axe, the same inexplicable positioning of the abandoned weapon. Yet this time, both victims survived the initial assault, though their accounts of the attack would only deepen the mystery. Bissumer claimed he awoke to find a tall figure standing over their bed, but could provide no details about the attacker's appearance. When pressed by investigators, he insisted that the person seemed to shift and blur in the darkness, as if composed of shadow itself. Harriet Lowe, despite suffering severe head trauma, corroborated this impossible description. She added that the attacker had whispered something in a language that sounded like Latin, though she could not recall the specific words. The investigation took an even stranger turn when detectives discovered that every attack occurred on nights when the moon was in its waning phase. Meteorological records showed that each assault happened during periods of unusual atmospheric pressure, conditions that local weather experts could not explain. The humidity levels on these nights consistently measured at exactly 73%, regardless of seasonal variations or weather patterns. As summer gave way to autumn, the attacks continued with relentless precision. Anna Schneider was found unconscious in her home on Elmira Street, her skull fractured but her life intact. Joseph Romano died from axe wounds inflicted in his residence on Tonti Street. Each scene revealed the same impossible elements: the surgical entry, the abandoned axe positioned at that precise angle, and the complete absence of any physical evidence that might identify the perpetrator. The most disturbing discovery came from Dr. Joseph Kurz, the coroner assigned to examine the victims. His confidential report, sealed for decades, revealed that all survivors exhibited identical neurological symptoms in the weeks following their attacks. Each victim reported experiencing vivid dreams of walking through New Orleans streets that looked familiar yet subtly wrong. Buildings appeared in locations where they had never existed, and the Mississippi River flowed in the opposite direction. The dreams shared another common element that Dr. Kurz noted with growing alarm. Every survivor described encountering the same elderly woman in their nocturnal visions. She appeared to be of Creole descent, wearing clothing from the previous century, and always stood at the intersection of Royal and St. Louis streets. In each dream, she would approach the victim and speak a single phrase in French: "Il reviendra quand les morts chanteront," he will return when the dead sing. The terror reached its peak in March of 1919, when the Times-Picayune newspaper received a letter that would become one of the most analyzed documents in criminal history. The correspondence, written in elegant script with expensive ink, claimed to be from the killer himself. The author identified himself as the Axeman and made a chilling announcement: he would spare anyone who played jazz music in their home on the night of March 19th. The letter contained details about the attacks that had never been released to the public. The writer knew about the precise angles of the abandoned axes, the atmospheric conditions during each assault, and even referenced the dreams experienced by the survivors. Most unsettling of all, the letter was written on paper that forensic experts determined to be manufactured in 1875, decades before the attacks began. March 19, 1919, became known as the night New Orleans refused to sleep. Jazz music poured from every window, every doorway, every street corner. The entire city transformed into a massive musical celebration, with residents convinced that their lives depended on keeping the music playing until dawn. Dance halls remained open all night, and even the most conservative families gathered around their pianos and phonographs. No attacks occurred that night, lending credence to the killer's promise. However, several residents reported seeing the same figure walking through the French Quarter during the early morning hours. Witnesses described a tall person wearing a dark coat, carrying what appeared to be an axe, moving with purpose through the revelry. Each witness insisted that the figure cast no reflection in the numerous shop windows along the route. The final documented attack occurred in October of 1919, when Mike Pepitone was killed in his home on 2nd Street. His wife Rose claimed she saw the attacker fleeing through their backyard, but her description defied belief. She insisted that the killer appeared to dissolve into mist as he reached the back fence, leaving behind only the scent of burning sulfur and the sound of distant jazz music. The investigation into Pepitone's death revealed the most baffling evidence yet collected. Crime scene photographers discovered that their equipment malfunctioned in specific areas of the house. Cameras that worked perfectly in the front rooms produced only blank images when used in the bedroom where the attack occurred. When the film was developed, instead of showing the crime scene, the photographs revealed images of the same locations but from decades earlier, showing furniture and decorations that had never existed in the Pepitone home. Detective D'Antonio's final report, filed just weeks before his retirement, contained observations that his superiors deemed too disturbing for public release. He noted that the killer's footprints, when they could be found, showed an unusual wear pattern that suggested the person walked differently than any human he had encountered. The impressions indicated that the attacker placed equal weight on both the heel and toe simultaneously, a gait that orthopedic experts declared anatomically impossible. The most chilling discovery came from the New Orleans Public Library, where a research librarian named Margaret Trent uncovered historical records that seemed to predict the Axeman's attacks. Birth and death records from the 1800s contained references to similar killings that occurred in exact 70-year cycles. The documents, written in multiple languages and stored in different sections of the archive, all contained the same phrase that appeared in the survivors' dreams: "Il reviendra quand les morts chantent." Margaret Trent's research revealed that the attacks followed a pattern that extended far beyond the documented 1918 to 19 period. Cemetery records showed unusual activity during each cycle, with groundskeepers reporting that certain graves appeared to have been disturbed from within. The affected burial sites all belonged to individuals who had died violent deaths, and their headstones showed signs of recent carving, despite being decades old. The investigation officially ended in December of 1919, when authorities declared that the Axeman had either died or left New Orleans permanently. However, police records show that similar attacks occurred in other cities along the Mississippi River in the following years. Memphis, St. Louis, and Chicago all reported killings that matched the New Orleans pattern exactly. The surgical entry, the abandoned axe positioned at precise angles, and the complete absence of identifying evidence. Dr. Kurz's final report, discovered in the basement of Charity Hospital 50 years later, contained his most disturbing conclusion. Based on his examination of the victims and the crime scenes, he determined that the attacks were not random acts of violence, but part of a larger pattern that spans centuries. His research into historical records revealed similar killings dating back to the founding of New Orleans, always occurring in 70-year cycles, always following the same ritualistic methodology. The sealed police files contain one final piece of evidence that investigators could never explain. Every crime scene yielded traces of a unique pollen that botanists could not identify. The substance appeared to come from a flowering plant that did not exist in Louisiana or anywhere else in North America. When subjected to carbon dating, the pollen samples returned results that placed their origin in the 14th century, long before European settlement of the region. The last entry in Detective D'Antonio's personal journal, written shortly before his death in 1951, contained a warning that the New Orleans Police Department chose to ignore. He calculated that based on the 70-year cycle, the next series of attacks would begin in 1989. When that year arrived, several unsolved murders in the French Quarter exhibited characteristics remarkably similar to the original Axeman killings, but the connections were never officially acknowledged. What do you think really happened during those foggy nights when jazz music became a shield against an impossible killer? Subscribe to uncover more cases where the official explanations leave far more questions than answers.